In the bitter heart of November 1838, in the Wyoming high country west of the Wind River Range, a man was failing. The land was a vast white sheet, pulled taut by a wind that never stopped. It was a wind that didn't just howl, it hissed, carrying fine crystals of ice that stung any exposed skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The sky was a low, bruised purple, promising more snow, and the temperature had not risen above freezing in 3 weeks. In the thicket of lodgepole pine, the only sound was the deep thump of snow falling from overburdened branches and the rhythmic, desperate crunch of Elias Thorne's moccasins. He was checking his line, and he was checking it with a cold knot of dread in his stomach. Elias was a young man, barely 25, but the high pass was aging him by the day. He'd come west from Pennsylvania, full of stories of beaver plume worth a man's yearly wages, but he had found something else entirely. He'd found an environment that didn't just resist him, it actively, intelligently tried to erase him. He knelt, his raw hands fumbling with the frozen chain. The trap was sprung. The heavy steel jaws were shut tight, not on the leg of a beaver or a wolf, but on empty air. Beside it, printed neatly in the fresh powder, was the track of a large wolf. It had come, seen the poorly hidden trap, and with contemptuous intelligence had used a single paw to flip the pan from a safe distance, springing it without risk. It was the 3rd time this week. He looked at the trap, a standard number 3 new house, and felt a surge of useless anger. It was a good trap, forged steel, strong enough, but it was wrong. It was loud. It smelled of metal and the bacon fat he'd used to grease it. It smelled, he was beginning to realize, of him. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against his thin wool coat. He was trapping to survive, not for wealth, but for food and the furs to trade for powder and flour. And he was starving. The wolves were eating his bait, the beaver were ignoring his sets, and the deep, abiding cold was seeping into his bones. The way he was taught to do this, the civilized way, was a spectacular failure. He was building his survival on a faulty foundation, and in the high pass, the penalty for bad design was a slow, cold death. Elias Thorne had arrived in the Rockies during the summer rendezvous, a chaos of trade, whiskey, and tall tales. He had spent his modest savings on what the seasoned trappers at Pierre's Hole told him he needed. He bought a dozen steel traps, a good Hawken rifle, and enough powder and lead to last the winter. He'd built his cabin not with the careful, interlocking saddle notch he knew from back east, but a fast, sloppy dog-trot cabin meant to get a roof over his head before the snows. The men he'd listened to were brigade trappers, part of a large company, who trapped an area hard and fast and then moved on, relying on numbers and company supply lines. Elias was alone. He had set his line just as they'd instructed. He used heavy bait, a chunk of deer meat, a sliver of bacon. He set his traps near obvious dens, on the trails he could see. He used their lures, mixtures of castor and anise oil that to his nose smelled powerful and effective. For the first 2 weeks he'd had beginner's luck. He'd caught a few young beaver, their pelts small, and one unwary fox. Then, as the cold deepened, the land seemed to learn his tricks. His traps were dug up, the bait was stolen. He found beaver traps sprung with nothing but a tuft of fur in the jaws. The animals were smarter than he'd been told. They didn't just blunder into his sets, they investigated them, tested them, and defeated them. His cabin, built fast, was a disaster of its own. The wind drove snow through the chinking. His fireplace, built too shallow, smoked him out, forcing him to choose between breathing and freezing. He was spending 16 hours a day just surviving, cutting wood, rechinking, resetting the same useless traps, and melting snow for water. His hands, constantly wet in the freezing temperatures and then dried by the fire, were a web of cracks that bled. He'd tried to compensate with force. If the wolves were stealing his bait, he'd build a stronger trap. He'd fashioned a snare from his last bit of rope, but a wolverine had simply chewed through it. He'd sat for 2 days, rifle in hand, waiting over a deer carcass. He'd gotten numb, his vision blurred, and the wolves, smelling him from a mile off, had never shown. He was exhausted. He was trapping like a man imposing his will, trying to force the animals into his steel. He was projecting his own logic onto them, assuming they would be tempted by the same things he was: greed, hunger, and haste. He was wrong. The high past demanded a different kind of thinking. It wasn't about force, it was about understanding. And as he stood over that empty, sprung trap, the wolf tracks mocking him, Elias Thorne finally understood. The standard method was a lie. It wasn't just his execution that was failing. The entire philosophy was wrong. He nearly died twice that month. The first time was a fall through thin ice on the creek, a shocking, breathless plunge that soaked him to the waist. He had made it back to his cabin, stripped his clothes, and spent 30 hours shivering violently in his blankets, his body burning through his last reserves of energy to fight the hypothermia. The second time was starvation. His flour was gone, his salt pork a memory. He was boiling scraps of leather for a thin, bitter soup when the smoke from a different chimney saved him. He'd staggered 1/2 mile through the drifts, following a scent he barely believed, and found a dugout cabin, almost invisible, built into the side of a hill. The man inside was Francois Kestrel Dubois. Kestrel was Métis, a man who lived between worlds, part Cree, part French-Canadian. He was perhaps 40, with a face that looked like carved hickory, and he moved with a silence that made Elias feel clumsy and loud. Kestrel was not a fur trapper in the way the men at the rendezvous were. He was a resident. He was there with his wife and 2 children, and his cabin was warm. It didn't smoke. Kestrel fed him a stew of beaver meat and wild onions. Elias, ashamed and weak, eventually asked him, his voice cracking, I can't catch anything. The wolves, they're too smart." Kestrel listened, his dark eyes watching Elias. He looked at Elias's hands, the cracked, bleeding knuckles. He looked at his moccasins, stiff and poorly oiled. He didn't say anything. The next morning, he wordlessly handed Elias a pair of snowshoes and jerked his head toward the door. He didn't take Elias to his trapline. He took him on a walk. For hours, they just walked. Kestrel would stop, point, not at a den, not at a track. He pointed at a subtle ridge in the snow where the wind had scoured it thin. "The wolf walks here," Kestrel said, his voice a low rumble. "He does not like deep snow. He likes to hear. He likes to see. This is his highway." He led Elias to the creek. He pointed to a spot where the water ran faster, where the ice was thin. "The beaver comes here for air. But he does not come to the bank. He comes here," request. "Your traps," Kestrel finally said, "they smell of you. They smell of iron. They smell of fear. You walk on the trail. The wolf walks on the ridge. You put your trap in the water. The beaver builds his under the water. You are trapping where you want them to be. You must trap where they are." Kestrel showed him one of his own traps. It wasn't steel, it was a deadfall, a massive log propped up on an intricate figure-4 trigger made of sticks. It smelled of pine and earth, nothing more. He showed him his steel beaver traps. They were rust-colored, dark. "You must boil them," he said. "Boil them with the spruce needles, with the bark of the aspen. You must kill the man-smell. You must become the smell of the forest." He explained the blind set, a trap with no bait, no lure, placed in a narrow channel dug in the mud under the ice, where the beaver's swimming feet must hit the pan. It wasn't about temptation, it was about inevitability. Elias watched, and for the first time he understood. He wasn't hunting an animal. He was hunting a mind. He had to stop thinking like a man and start thinking like a shadow, like the water, like the wind. Elias returned to his own cabin, but he was a changed man. He ate the last of the food Kestrel had given him and spent the next 3 days not trapping, but thinking. He sat by his smoky fire, which he now understood was smoky because he'd built the chimney too wide and the flue too shallow. And he planned. He was no longer a trapper. He was a silent engineer, designing a system not of force, to be imposed on the wilderness, but of subtlety, to be integrated within it. His first act was to take every piece of steel he owned, his traps, his chains, even the small hatchet he used for kindling, and boil them. He built a great fire outside and filled his largest pot with snow, adding bundles of spruce needles, aspen bark, and dried sagebrush. He boiled the metal for hours, the acrid green smell of the forest infusing the steel, covering the man smell, the factory oil, and the bacon grease. He handled them only with gloves that had been boiled in the same solution. He stored them, not in his cabin, where they would absorb the smell of smoke and fear, but in a dedicated canvas bag, hung in a tree, exposed to the clean, cold air. Then he planned his line. He didn't look for dens. He looked for highways. He spent a day on snowshoes, just watching, mapping the highways Kestrel had shown him. He found the subtle, wind-scoured ridges the wolves used to avoid the deep drifts. He found the game trails choked with brush that acted as funnels, forcing deer and the wolves that hunted them into a single-file line. He studied the creek, breaking the ice in dozens of places until he understood the pathways under the surface. He found the drown poles, submerged logs, that he could use as anchors. He was designing a system of interception. He would know to lure the animals. He would simply and lethally be waiting where they were already going. He also redesigned his traps. For the wolves, he wouldn't use his precious steel. He would use the forest itself. He would build deadfalls, massive 400-pound logs balanced on the delicate figure-4 triggers Kestrel had shown him. The trigger would be set, so the wolf, in taking the small, scent-free piece of bait, would have to put its head and shoulders under the log. It was a machine of pure physics, built of the landscape itself. For the beaver, he would use his newly boiled steel traps, but only in blind sets and drowning sets. He would build his new system not for speed, but for efficiency. It was a massive risk. He was spending his last reserves of energy on preparation, with no guarantee of a return. But he knew with a certainty that settled his nerves that the old way was a guarantee of failure. The implementation was the hardest work of his life. It was a labor of meticulous, freezing, and silent construction. He began with the wolf sets. He spent a full day building just one. He found the perfect choke point in the forest, a narrow game trail between two massive boulders. He used his axe to fell a thick dead lodgepole pine, 9 feet long and heavier than he was. He dragged it into position. Then, the delicate part, the trigger. He spent an hour carving the 3 pieces of the figure-4 trigger from dry, seasoned wood: the vertical post, the diagonal brace, and the horizontal trigger stick. He set the heavy log on this delicate scaffold. It was terrifying. A single slip, a misplaced nudge, and the log would crush his hands. He set it, tested the tension, and reset it. He placed a small, frozen chunk of a snowshoe hare behind the trigger. To get it, the wolf would have to commit. He backed away, walking in his own footsteps, leaving no sign. Then he went to the water. This was the coldest, most brutal part of the design. To set his beaver traps, he had to become the water. He put on his wool leggings and waded into the creek, the icy water a burning, numbing agony. He walked in the water for a quarter mile, the water washing his scent away, hiding his trail. He found the spot he had scouted, a narrow channel in the creek bed. He took his axe and, bracing himself, chopped a hole in the 2-foot-thick ice. He reached down, his arms submerged to the shoulder in water so cold it felt like fire. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but he fought it. He cleared a small channel in the mud on the creek bottom. He took one of his boiled No. 4 Newhouse traps from its canvas bag. He set the spring, the click of the dog, latching onto the pan sounding loud in the silence. He carefully placed the trap in the muddy channel. Then he took the chain and attached it to a drown pole, a heavy waterlogged stick he'd prepared. He wedged the pole into the mud so that the trap was anchored to the deep. The theory was simple. When the beaver's foot hit the pan, the trap would spring. The beaver's first instinct would be to dive for deep water. The trap, the chain, and the heavy drown pole would pull it under, and it would drown silently, quickly, leaving no scent of struggle, no blood in the water to warn the other members of the colony. He did this 4 times, wading from spot to spot, his legs turning a mottled, waxy purple, his hands shaking so badly he could barely set the springs. He stumbled back to his cabin, his clothes freezing solid as he walked, and fell into a shivering, exhausted sleep, not knowing if his desperate, intricate design would hold. He waited 2 days. A storm hit. A classic high-country blizzard that buried the pass in 3 new feet of snow and sent the temperature plummeting to 30 below zero. The wind was a solid, screaming wall of ice. It was the perfect test. The deep snow would make the game trails and ridges, the highways he had mapped, the only viable paths. The animals would be forced by the environment itself into his traps. The cold made him hesitate. Leaving the cabin was a life-or-death decision, but the hunger, now a constant twisting ache, drove him out. He put on his snowshoes, his face wrapped in wool, until only his eyes were exposed, and stepped into the whiteout. He went to the wolf set first. He could barely see the boulders through the driving snow. He approached, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw it from 20 yards away. The massive log, the one he'd so carefully balanced, was down. It was flat against the snow. There was no trigger, no delicate scaffold, just the heavy, final weight of the log. He ran the last few feet. Underneath, preserved by the cold, was a massive grey wolf. The trigger had worked perfectly. The physics had held. The wolf, desperate for the bait in the storm, had put its head into the space, nudged the stick, and the log had done its work. It was a clean, silent kill. He was shaking, not from cold, but from a profound, terrifying relief. He reset the massive trap, a process that took an hour in the deep snow, and moved on. He reached the creek, It was a frozen, featureless expanse. He found his landmarks, the tall pine, the split rock. He took his axe and began to chop through the ice where he'd set his first trap. The hole was frozen solid. He broke through. He reached down into the black, stinging water, feeling for the drown pole. It wasn't where he'd left it. His heart sank, but then his gloved hand hit the chain. It was pulled taut, leading into the deep. He grabbed it and pulled. It was heavy, an anchor of resistance. He hauled hand over hand, and finally the prize broke the surface. A massive 70-pound beaver, its fur thick, dark, and perfect. It was frozen solid, caught, just as he'd planned. He checked his other 3 water sets. All 3 were full, 4 beaver, 1 wolf. In one night, his new system had brought him more food and fur than he had gathered in the previous 2 months. It was not luck, it was design. The change in Elias Thorne's fortunes was immediate and profound. When he arrived at the spring rendezvous on the Green River, he was no longer the desperate, half-starved greenhorn. He led a pack mule laden with 80 prime beaver plew, all thick, dark winter fur. The other trappers, the mountain men who had given him bad advice, were stunned. Their own catches were meager. The beaver had been trapped out, they claimed, but Elias had brought in a haul that harkened back to the glory days. At first, they were suspicious, but then a young trapper from Missouri, Josiah Prentice, who had lost his partner to the cold and was on the brink of starvation himself, quietly asked Elias for help. Elias, remembering the kindness of Kestrel Dubois, did not just tell him, he showed him. He took Josiah on his line the next winter. He taught him not about lures, but about scent. He made him boil his traps in spruce water until they smelled of the forest. He taught him how to read the highways in the snow, how to identify the subtle funnels in the landscape. He showed him how to build a figure-4 deadfall, a piece of simple, lethal engineering that used the weight of the forest itself. He taught him the brutality of the blind set, the art of wading in the freezing creek to erase his trail, the patience of thinking like the water. Josiah learned, and the next year Josiah taught 2 other men. The Thorne method, as it became known, though Elias always insisted on calling it the Kestrel method, began to spread. It wasn't a single tool, it was a system. Some trappers adopted the scent boiling, others the deadfall triggers, but the most successful were those who adopted the entire philosophy. That trapping was not about lure, but about interception. This new, quieter, more intelligent form of trapping spread through the high passes. It was less glamorous than the bait-and-gun method, but it was infinitely more effective. The men who used it wasted less energy. They lost fewer traps to thieves, both animal and human. They survived the winters with more food and thicker bundles of fur. By 1850, as the beaver trade was dying, these methods were simply the way. They had been absorbed into the vernacular wisdom of the mountains, a legacy of survival passed from one man to the next, the origin unknown to most. Years later, historians and wildlife biologists would look back at these methods and understand the brilliant, intuitive science behind them. Elias Thorne and Kestrel Dubois had, without formal training, become masters of applied engineering and animal psychology. The standard method Elias had first tried was based on a simple, human-centric idea: lure. It assumed an animal was a simple machine, driven only by hunger. The Kestrel method was a sophisticated, systems-based approach. The boiling of the traps was a remarkable piece of intuitive chemical engineering. It wasn't superstition, it was olfactory camouflage. By boiling the steel with spruce and aspen, Elias was removing the volatile organic compounds of human sweat, oils, and manufactured metal. He was replacing them with the background noise of the forest, rendering the traps invisible to a nose that could smell a man a mile away. The blind set was a masterstroke of psychological profiling. It did not rely on hunger, a variable. It relied on habit, a constant. Kestrel knew the beaver must use its underwater channels. The trap wasn't an invitation, it was an unavoidable physical certainty placed directly in the path of the animal's compulsive behavior. The deadfall trap was the most elegant design of all. It solved the problem of the wolf, an animal too strong and too smart for a standard trap. The Figure-4 trigger is a masterpiece of simple machines, a way to use leverage and potential energy. It allowed the faint nudge from a wolf's nose, a tiny, investigatory force, to release hundreds of pounds of kinetic energy from the log. It was an engine of death, built from sticks, perfectly adapted to the materials at hand. This system was not about brute force, it was about funneling. It was about identifying the choke points in the environment, the critical nodes in the animal's travel network, and placing a trap there. It was using the topography, the snowdrifts, the boulders, and the ice as part of the machine. It was a form of systems thinking that modern engineering would only formally recognize a century later. Elias Thorne lived in the mountains for another decade. He saw the beaver trade collapse and the wagon trains begin their slow, grinding journey west. He guided a train himself, eventually settling in the Oregon Territory, in a valley that smelled of damp pine. He built a house, and this time he built it right. He sited it away from the wind, with a deep foundation and a flue that drew perfectly. He was known as a quiet man, a man who, his neighbors said, seemed to be able to predict the weather and knew where deer would be before they appeared. He died an old man, his hands forever scarred by the memory of the ice water, his knuckles thick and broken. The knowledge he had passed on, Kestrel's knowledge, outlived him. It became woven into the fabric of the high country, a silent legacy of survival. The trap, he had learned, was not just a piece of steel, it was an argument. It was a physical test of an idea. The first. Failed traps were a statement of arrogance, an assumption that the world was simple and would yield to a man's clumsy desire. The trapline he built with Kestrel's wisdom was something else entirely. It was a statement of humility. It was built on patience, observation, and a profound, intimate respect for the thing it was designed to kill. It was an admission that to survive, one could not command the wilderness. One had to understand it so deeply, so completely, that you could predict its next move. Survival was not, in the end, about the strength of the steel or the power of the lure. It was about the quiet, brutal, and deadly accuracy of a design that fit perfectly, silently, into the existing mechanisms of the world. It was about seeing the landscape not as a resource to be taken, but as a system to be read.